Welcome to the Science of CX podcast. My name is Steve Pappas, a former serial entrepreneur turned CX obsessed expert. And each week we bring you an inspiring message and insight into how customer experience can catapult your business to soar, grow, and accelerate beyond what you thought was possible. We seek out experts to interview and help you on your journey to CX in the science of CX. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Science of CX, where we talk about everything to do with the customer. The customers are the people that pay us, the customers are the people that we cater to, and the universe should revolve around the customer. So today we've got an interesting show. We've got Jim Tincher on, and Jim is going to have a little bit of information for us around all things around the heart of the customer. So Jim, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
Well, I've been looking forward to this, Jim, really. I've got to tell you. And maybe what I should do is give folks a little bit of your bio just so they understand, and maybe we can elaborate on some of these things. So Jim Tincher, CCXP, is a nationally recognized customer experience expert, journey mapper, author, keynote speaker, and entrepreneur in his own right. Jim led customer experience programs at Best Buy and United Health Group before launching his innovative CX consultancy called The Heart of the Customer. Since 2013, the firm has been helping startups to Fortune 100 organizations use voice of the customer research to improve customer journeys. Jim's book, How Hard Is It to Be Your Customer, is an authoritative guide in capturing the voice of the customer to drive customer-centric action that boosts loyalty, satisfaction, and revenue. So maybe we should talk about that for a little bit. You know, the how hard is it to be your customer, Jim, sounds like a great starting off point, because it sounds like, you know, in today's world, doing business with some companies has a lot of friction, a lot of inertia.
Oh, yeah.
So what are you asking in how hard is it to be your customer?
Well, really, that is about understanding what are the hoops you're putting your customers through. We commonly see issues where the different silos inside an organization all optimize their silo, leaving it up to the customer to find out how to get from one point to the next. We found that everywhere from hospitals, health clubs and a lot of our work is in business to business, big global companies that have really optimized the silos. But then again, it's up to the customer to try to figure out, how do I get from silo to silo? How do I find out what's actually happening? And how do I work with this company? And a lot of organizations have not taken the time to make that easy.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're describing, just so I can kind of paraphrase it, it sounds like you're forcing the customer in many cases to travel a complex big city with no map or no GPS. Right? I mean, how do they know how to go from silo to silo? I mean, what ends up happening is I have a problem. I end up going to where I think they can solve my problem, and I end up getting moved around the organization until I find some level of satisfaction. That sounds like a recipe for disaster if any businesses are approaching the customer journey that way. So let's talk about that a little bit, and maybe why don't we start with, how did you get here? I always love asking the question to people that are in CX is, what was the path that led you here? Because your background, your experiences, the knowledge you gained along the way all color how you can help companies today deal with customer experience issues.
Oh, yeah, and definitely so. And so I started out in small business and went from there to Best Buy, and just naturally assumed, I'm a little naive, that every company is customer obsessed, that they're just really focused on the customer and how they do it. And then I went to a Fortune 100 company and realized there were other models, and that there were organizations focused more on operations. And literally in the division I was in, nobody in marketing or product development had ever met a client. And I remember asking, say, I'd like to go out and visit clients. And the ads came back, well, why? We don't have a budget for that, but budget, it's a plane trip. And I heard all the time, well, we don't need to visit clients. We are clients. Well, yeah, we're the most oddball, goofball clients ever because we think about a product 8-10 hours a day, whereas the research shows that our typical consumers using our service think about us 8 to 10 minutes a year. And so we had the most complex products in the marketplace. We were helped by a huge sales engine. And so we led the nation in sales. We also led the nation in percentage of people canceling our accounts. And so getting there to visit customers, going out there and learning what the real experience was very, very foundational. And I was so frustrated there that I started blogging at that point, Heart of the Customer. And for that, I started speaking. And the phrase heart of the customer kept coming up. I kept saying it. And so I thought, well, that's the name of the blog. And then a few years after that, I went out on my own, and that's where the name came from, is I was speaking just the heart of the customer phrase kept coming out. And this was in the early days of CX, so luckily nobody had taken the domain yet, and I was able to grab it. And so it was a blog site for a couple of years, and then 7 years ago started the company.
Wow. I think the name of your company really says it all. And those of us that are CX practitioners, those of us that have been in this part of the business for any number of years, really want to listen to the heart of the customer. So I'm glad you got the name and you got the domain too. Maybe we could kind of jump off there at what makes some people really good at CX and what has some of them failing at it. I mean, there's got to be some characteristics, or there's got to be some things that they look at, or angles that they're seeing, or data, maybe not looking at the data. So what makes some good and what makes some fail?
Well, a lot of it seems to be is a real understanding of the business in which they're in. And that sounds really naive and simplistic, but it's been interesting as we talk to people who are really effective in customer experience. A lot of them, this is their first time in customer experience. They come from another part of the business. They come from operations. They come from sales, maybe marketing, but they've learned about what matters to the business, and they're able then to communicate with leaders in a way that resonates with them. When we see them less successful, often they are career CX people, maybe come from market research or marketing, and they want to talk about the net promoter score. They want to talk about the customer effort score. And in CX circles, if you want to get a lot of people to show up to your CX event, just put the word metrics in the title, and they're there. You can put it called the metrics of pizza. It doesn't matter. As long as the word metrics is there, CX people will show up, but the CEO won't. Yeah, the CEO cares about metrics. The CEO cares about what's going to keep me from getting fired. That's going to be revenue growth, and that's going to be decreasing costs. Those are the things that keep your CEO from getting fired. That's what he or she cares about. And when we talk about the most effective CX people, they're able to have that conversation and show how a simpler experience or a better emotional connection will lead to decreased cost, increased revenue. But that's a relatively rare skill. And when I go back to my time at that Fortune 100 company, I sucked at it. I mean, I was terrible. I had the world's best business case because we led the nation in percentage of people canceling accounts. Plus, 1 out of 7 people could receive hundreds of dollars of free money if they just signed up for an account and weren't doing it. So 2 really good benefit cases. Instead, I just said, we just need to listen to customers. I mean, I sound like a lot of our tribe that just listen to customers, everything will be great. I didn't take the step to say, oh, and by the way, here's millions of dollars in free revenue if we do that. And I see that same problem played out all the time. We talk about what we can easily measure, net promoter score, customer effort score, without saying those who are a promoter spend 10% more with us or stay 6 months longer. That's really where, as a capability, we're not closing that loop.
Right. So figuring out what that kind of metric is very important. So maybe we could turn a little bit to the ROI, because I know you do a lot of work around the ROI of CX, and not a lot of our folks that we've had on the show really have an ROI formula that that leads to understanding the ROI of CX. And the reason why I'm asking the question is because, as you said before, the CEO and maybe the board are driven by certain requirements, right? They're either driven by some liquidity event, some exit, some profit sharing, whatever is driving them. It doesn't necessarily have a CX component in it. People below the CEO probably have something in their comp plans that is geared around levels of satisfaction and things of that nature. So how do you look at the ROI of CX? If I could ask that, that big question.
Sure. Let me just take a step back first. Tell me why we got so interested in this. And so, a year and a half, Bob Thompson at Customer Think came out with research showing that 1 out of 4 programs could show business impact. 3/4 couldn't. Many of your listeners probably saw Harley Manning's prediction in December that 1 out of 4 CX people will be fired because they couldn't show business impact. And that difference really fascinated me. I wanted to understand what separated the 1 out of 4 who could really show impact and the 1 out of 4 who are going to be fired because they couldn't. And so we started interviewing people. We've interviewed now 85 so far this year to understand the answer to that question. And what we're finding is that most programs can't show a direct correlation between Net Promoter Score and revenue. It really requires a lot of data to do that connection. So, I was invited to Comcast headquarters back in October. They can do it because they have 1 million surveys. 1 million surveys will let you find lots of statistical connections. But the average B2B company might have 200, 300 surveys. And so trying to draw a straight line between your survey and your revenue is hard. And so a lot of people stop. But we came out with a white paper on this, CX for Skeptics, showing the ROI of CX. And we show 3 ways of doing it. That's one. But we find more commonly is tying to a very specific, different financial outcome. It'll vary by business. That could be product attachment. That could be product margin, retention of specific set of customers, but going with a finer thing that you can actually take credit for. And the third way is to do journey specific. So you do your journey mapping. That's what we're known for. And then you tie it to specific financial outcome, and then you start pulling levers to see how that outcome moves. But that's what it really comes back to is that it's going to be very hard to show top line revenue connection to CX. It can be done, but it takes a lot of data. One of the examples I give is, let's say that you're at your annual meeting and you're preparing for next year, and you tell the organization that, well, if we look at all the secondary data like Forrester's put out there and others, we know that the best customer experience programs could generate about 10% more revenue than the rest. So that increase in sales last year, I'm claiming that. That was all CX. Well, your sales and marketing friends are going to have a lot to say about that. It's going to become a very uncomfortable conversation. There's no way they're going to give you that credit. But if instead you say, hey, look, we did this journey mapping work, and as a result, we looked at our onboarding journey. Onboarding is a key part of especially B2B journeys. We looked at the onboarding journey, and we changed things. We really made it easier to get onboarded. We shortened the time to value from a month to 2 weeks. As a result, the customers who came through a new onboarding process are now ordering 10% more products than the rest. So that credit comes back to our CX work. Well, then you're going to get that credit. That makes a lot of sense because you've built a business case. You've first isolated what was it like before. You made a change, and then you looked at the results afterwards. That's where you can get credit, and that's how you can show the ROI of CX.
Interesting. So we separate the 3 components. So we separate data versus surveys that people are doing versus the outcomes that you're talking about to determine really what's going on, what's going wrong, what's going right. So is it when a client comes to you, is the goal to work with the client to figure out their business and what their killer metrics are, and then you concentrate on looking at those and then determining where the outliers are of things that are not getting through properly or things that are not happening, to then say, okay, let's prioritize. Because I guess it's also an exercise in prioritization too, because there could be bleeding head wounds all over the place, but you've got to help them focus in on the biggest wins first, and then start looking at the secondary and tertiary ones too. Does that make sense?
Oh, perfectly. And so, a lot of times that first call, we'll talk to them. In our book, we outline 5 critical questions to ask in journey mapping. Number 1 is, what's the business problem? Mm-hmm. And that can take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 calls to get that right. Often we hear from people that the business problem is that they don't have a journey map. That's not a business problem. A business problem is we have retention issues. We have a high cost to serve. We have a low share of wallet. And so we'll spend a lot of time working with that. That leads then to questions 2 and 3, which is, what's the right journey? Who's the right customer? Then from there is, what's the right approach? Get the voice of the customer. And the most important question is, who's on the team? But we identify first, what are we trying to solve for? And going back to the example of onboarding, which again it varies, could be installation, implementation, depending on the type of journey. But that is commonly a big moment of truth in the ongoing customer relationship, because that's where your customers learn how to work with you, rightly or wrongly. Then as we go in there, we start understanding, okay, what are the points of friction? What are the emotions that go throughout there? And then comes back to what you talked about, the killer metric. In almost every journey, we will find a killer metric. One number, not a survey score usually, but one number that really the group can rally around to make a difference. And Amazon uses number of costs per order as their overall killer metric. Delta used canceled flights to get them from 600 down to 60. One metric that's a business metric everybody can drive around. For a number of our journeys, it is time. And with one client, when we looked at those who came out of onboarding, who were just ordering a lot and just great survey scores, but more importantly, high share of wallet, lots of repeat ordering, versus those who came out and maybe closed their account 6 months later or weren't ordering most. They hadn't really focused on this supplier instead, our client. It had a lot to do with how long it took to get through onboarding, the time to value. And we found if the time to value was 2 weeks or less, then they had a really good outcome. If it took more than 2 weeks, that was the magic number, then customers are very frustrated and they never really centralize their spending with our client. Well, that's how we get the attention of executives. We say, okay, that 2 weeks is the magic time. And now everybody in the organization is now focused on the 2 weeks. And to your point earlier, let's look at the outliers. Look at those who are taking longer to figure out why that is. And that's when you bring in Six Sigma, because you have a clear customer problem. Then you bring in your capabilities, your operations group, say, how do we take care of these outliers that are over 2 weeks? Because we know that leads to better customer outcomes. And what's interesting about the whole conversation is the word I didn't use is the survey. When we look at the most effective programs, they have surveys, of course. The survey is a diagnostic. It's not the score. It's just a diagnostic to help understand. In this case, the score is share of wallet. That's what the executive cares about. That's what the finance cares about. And that's what CX should care about. The survey is simply a way to help understand more, to diagnose where problems are happening.
You touched upon something there very interesting, and I agree with everything you've said. That time, I think in every speech that I've given, I talk about solving the problem of time throughout the journey. That time rears its ugly head from the pre-sales process all the way through to the support and care happening after the sale, and it is an area that most people do not concentrate on. They concentrate on the mechanics of things. They don't concentrate on the time, and it's not just the time for the customer, and we talk about that as it relates to friction, right? But it's the time of everything. It's the time that it takes you to pick up the phone. It's the time that it takes you to find information to solve the problem after the sale. It's the time that it takes you, and as your example said, the time it takes to get them onboarded, the time it takes, time to value. That interesting little word seems to come up a lot. And I don't know if our listeners are thinking about time as a dimension in itself as much as they probably should. Sometimes it's the journey. Sometimes it's I do this, they do this. This is what the customer does. Then they move here. And, it's much more of the playing pong back and forth. But but figuring out where time is affecting the customer or the employee is definitely key. So I think you hit on a real critical area there. And I hope that our listeners really take heart to understanding time as being a big factor too.
It definitely is. And it's really part of the problem is the fact that time is marked across silos. So if you work with 4 silos across the organization, each silo is going to manage the time you're working with them. But nobody's managing the time you're going across silos. And so if it is a support issue, your first caller, the first person to talk to, they'll probably look at how long their call takes. Nobody's measuring that it takes a week for somebody to get back to the customer. They're only measuring their own individual ports. The handoffs can be killers, can really add to that time.
Right. Well, with that, I'm going to have to take a quick break. Everyone, we will be back in 40 seconds.
Panviva has 25 years of empowering customer service, and we have deep expertise in how people actually use information from our roots in learning and performance. We offer accurate, consistent information on demand to every channel, most relevant knowledge at your people's exact moment of need, integrated, streamlined internal processes, systems that deliver memorable and remarkable customer experiences that boost customer attention and loyalty every time, and knowledge that extends across your entire digital landscape. To learn more, visit Panviva at www.panviva.com.
And we're back. We're talking with Jim Tincher from Heart of the Customer. Jim, I think the killer metrics, dealing with the outliers, are important. You mentioned that you've been doing a lot of interviews with companies, and I imagine all types of companies across different industries. What are you finding is important to them? What are you finding that they initially tell you is important, and then maybe after you talk to them more, does that change?
Yes, we've talked to 85 people so far as of this morning, this year. Really going to answer that question, what separates those who are really successful from the rest? And when we ask that, we ask a series of questions. One of them is, what does success mean for your role? And if I ask your CEO what success looks like in your role for him or her, would they answer the same way? And one of the first things we can use to really look at success is if they have a clear picture of what the CEO expects in their role. Or a lot of people say, I really don't know. So that's the first clue. The best have a really clear picture that this is what the CEO is looking to accomplish at my role. And they may be 4 levels below the CEO, but they understand here's what the CEO cares about. Similarly, we'll ask, what data do you use to evaluate the state of the customer experience? And as you would guess, if the customer experience person, it's overwhelmingly surveys. But others are really bringing in, we look at the best of the best and say, well, there's surveys, of course, but there's also call volumes. Are we having a lot of people having to call in, especially if it's multiple calls to get the situation resolved? Then we know our experience is going so well. And then also turnover or loss of clients, churn is another one. So we talk to the best. They're using a multifaceted approach to look at the state of the customer experience. And then we'll ask them, well, how does your CEO evaluate the state of the customer experience? And some will say surveys, but most recognize that survey is only a component, and they will look at things like retention of clients, the big one, how much they're spending. And then we'll throw in our trick question, which is, how would your favorite finance person evaluate the customer experience? And the overwhelming answer we get is, I don't know anybody in finance.
Mm.
And that's a real opportunity there.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't. You really think about that. How do finance people come into the customer experience equation?
But only through deliberate effort. But they do actually look at things. They would never say, I look at the customer experience. That's a phrase that they don't use. And we've interviewed a number of finance people as part of this initiative. And the first answer from many of them is, I don't look at surveys. I don't need to talk to you. But we go, okay, but when we get down to them, they look at things like, I remember talking to a CFO at a bank. And he said, well, we look at actually what we care about are the number of accounts with us and share of wallet. That's what we care about. But it's hard to measure that directly. We look at number of accounts with share of wallet. But we look at how much money is in the account and revenue from that. But we also look at activity, because we know the more activities a customer has with us, then the higher the net promoter score is. But more importantly, the more accounts they have with us and the longer they stay as customers. And so their finance group, this is one of the more informed finance groups that we talk to, but they're looking at the behavioral data and linking that to financial data. And that was through a partnership with their CX program, but that's a rare partnership. We have a number of CX people who are trying to show connection to ROI, to financial outcomes without their finance people, and that's a mistake. Really, you want to have finance being part of the conversation, because if nothing else, even if you can do all the calculations yourself, if you let your finance person communicate it, it's going to resonate much more, have way more credibility than the best customer experience person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I got to think that when clients call you, that they have to explain the business problem to you. And they've got to, and I'm wondering whether or not, as you're saying that, whether if the CEO talks to you, how they communicate that, if finance talks to you, or if marketing and sales talk to you, or some other part of the business, how do they tell you what the business problem is? And if you surveyed them all, would they all look at it from a different perspective?
Oh yeah, definitely so. Clearly, the CEO is going to be at the highest level, and they're going to look at where are our costs and where are we not seeing the revenue I expect to see. And that's a pretty common there, and they'll be able to go down a little bit further. Finance is going to overwhelmingly look at the costs and areas where they be spending more than they expect. Often, finance is focused on costs because it's more controllable. Sales will talk about that last customer they lost and why that was. And so it comes across differently from the organizations. And we found it a lot of times that organizations are not aligned on where the key business problems are. And in that case, the clients will bring us in to really do that survey across. And I don't mean online survey. I mean, just talk to all the different leadership to come up with a shared point of view that here's where the biggest opportunities are in the organization. And this is how customer experience can help. Interesting.
Well, just trying to keep an eye on the time here. Maybe what we could do is for our listeners, because our listeners run the gambit from small, medium-sized businesses to Fortune 500 companies and Global 2000s. But I'm wondering what tips can we give them? What real world scenarios can we give them? Because every business now, they're meeting on Zoom or they're meeting on Teams or some other video conferencing method. And they're thinking about these things. Now, given the fact that they're thinking about them a little differently today than they did 4 months ago, what are the things that we can have them do when they go back and they sit down and they meet with their team? What homework assignments can we give them to start thinking in terms of ROI of CX?
The first thing I'd say is set aside your survey. Just set that aside. Don't get rid of it. Just set it aside right now. And start looking at, from an organizational perspective, what are the biggest challenges that you're facing? Right now, it's likely to be high costs as well as probably lower participation and engagement from customers. We've been seeing as customers are so overwhelmed with COVID, they don't have the patience to figure out your convoluted systems. So look for where that behavior is most impacting the business. Is it A, high cost, maybe for support to work people through that? Or B, is it people dropping off engagement? Use that to now go look at, okay, that's the business probably want to go after. And then what I do is, okay, once you've done that, how do we know that to be true? What are the behavioral and operational data that are showing that to be true? Is that extra calls, lower calls? What's that? What can we learn about the operational data? And then financially, what are the outcomes from that? Is that a lower basket size in orders? Is it lower retention, fewer orders per client? So just do that. So usually start with the outcome, that the lower engagement, lower finances. Move back from there into the operational behavioral data. And now bring your survey back and plunk it in the middle and say, what can that tell us about why this is happening? What has changed from the survey responses? But you start with what the business cares about, which is the finances. Walk back to what most organization cares about, which is behavioral operational data. And then bring in your survey as a way to explain what's happening and to help you get to action. And then typically what you need to do next is to start doing something qualitative to learn the why. And that's really where we get focused in, is help understand why. And to bring your counterparts out to visit the customers, in this case probably virtually, to learn firsthand. Get your business partners as part of this. Talk to somebody in finance, marketing, operations, so that they can be hearing the same story you're hearing.
I love it. I love it. Jim, this has been great. So what I want to do is let people figure out how to get in touch with you here very easily and effortlessly. We want to just make people aware again of Jim's book, How Hard Is It to Be Your Customer? We also talked about the white paper, CX for Skeptics, showing the ROI of CX. I think they could just go to heartofthecustomer.com and go to the resources area to download that. And if they want to get in touch with you, I'm sure they could find you at heartofthecustomer.com. Is that right?
That's correct, as well as LinkedIn is a good place to find me as well.
Perfect. Jim, this has been a great conversation. We could go on forever, but unfortunately, we're subject to time also, as most people are. But I want to thank you very much for coming, and I hope you'll join us again someday.
I'd love that, Steve. This has been fun. I love talking to you, learning from you as well. And again, when I heard about your topic, your Science of CX, I was on board. I love this. So great work. Fantastic. I loved talking with you.
Perfect. Thank you. And everyone, that's another episode of The Science of CX. You've been listening to The Science of CX. My name is Steve Pappas. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, the highest compliment that you can give us is to subscribe, rate, and review The Science of CX. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next episode.